Few things would be more terrifying to a pilot than the prospect of running out of fuel mid-flight. But that is exactly what's about to happen to this Boeing 737 crew after having flown a heart-wrenching 6 approaches going on their 7th. How that was possible and what led up to it is what I'm going to tell you about today, so stay tuned. The story I'm going to tell you about today is the story of Jet Airways Flight 555, and it's actually one of the more crazy stories that I've ever come across. It's a story about communication, about, to a certain extent, bad luck and bad timing, but also decision making and how a single decision can have potentially devastating consequences going forward. The incident took place on the 18th of August 2015, and the aircraft that is involved is a Boeing 737-800, just like the type that I'm flying. The crew was quite experienced. The captain was 40 years old and had just under 6,700 hours, the majority of which he had flown on the 737. He was assisted by a first officer that was slightly less experienced. He had just under 1,500 hours of total time and about 580 on the type. They had both operated together on the day before, on the 17th of August, where they had flown from Cochin in India over towards Doha. And then they had a night stop there. They were fully rested on the 18th of August, which is the day of the incident. The flight that they were about to operate was a night flight, so they met up at 18:30 UTC, and that's about midnight local time, and they started doing the pre-flight preparation. The weather en route looked absolutely fine, but the weather on their destination looked like it could be potentially a little bit misty. However, the weather they had available for their planning was quite old. It was issued at 0900 UTC, so almost 15 hours earlier, but it was still valid. It indicated a visibility at the destination Cochin of about 4,000 meters with light winds from a northerly direction and clouds scattered at 1,500 feet and broken clouds at 9,000 feet. So this is fairly good weather. Their alternate airport, Bangalore, had even better weather with a visibility of 8,000 meters, winds from 290 at 10 knots, and some scattered clouds at 1,200 feet and broken clouds at 8,000 feet. So this was a perfectly good weather situation for the time. When we have a weather forecast that indicates that at the time of our arrival, plus 1 hour before and 1 hour after, the weather will be good enough for us to land using the approaches available at our destination, well then we only need one alternate airport. Now the alternate airport needs to have slightly better weather than our destination, just to give us a little bit better margin in case we have to divert. What we do is that we look at the best possible approach rate at our alternate airport, and then we go to the second best approach rate, and we make sure that the weather is still good enough to be able to take that. In this case, the crew looked at the weather and they figured that, yeah, this is good enough. We don't need 2 alternates and we don't need to look too much into it. So we could potentially take minimum fuel going here. But the captain looked a little bit closer at the weather and saw that even though it was better than the minimum required, it still wasn't great. There was still some mist there. And whenever you have mist, there's always a possibility that that mist might turn into fog or it might be worse than expected. So he thought, let's take a little bit extra fuel to enable us to hold a little bit when we get overhead Cochin. So that's what they did. They looked at their flight plan and they started calculating how much fuel they were actually going to take, taking this into consideration. Now here it's quite important for you guys to understand how we actually calculate our minimum fuel before we dispatch. So in the case of Jet Airways, they started off with adding taxi fuel. Taxi fuel was about 180 kilos, and that was calculated on a fuel burn of about 12 kilos per minute, giving them 15 minutes of taxi time, which is reasonable. The next thing that I added on was the trip fuel, and the trip fuel is calculated from brakes release for takeoff, climb, the standard instrument departure, then climb up to cruise level, the whole flight to top of descent, the descent into and including the standard arrival route, and then 240 kilos for the approach phase down to landing. In this case, the trip fuel was 11,112 kilos or 4 hours and 7 minutes. On top of this, we also add something called contingency fuel, and it is exactly what it sounds like. It's for contingencies. So maybe there's a thunderstorm en route that we need to divert around or something like that. This tends to be a minimum of 5% of the trip fuel. In this case, that was 556 kilos or 14 minutes. And then we add on the alternate fuel, which includes the mist approach at our destination, a climb to 1500 feet initially, then the standard instrument departure, the climb, cruise, and then descend into our alternate and a further approach. In this case, the fuel was to Bangalore and they needed 2,178 kilos for that. That was about 44 minutes of flying time. Now, the last amount of fuel that we need to add in order to find our minimum legal dispatch fuel is our final reserve fuel. And the final reserve fuel needs to enable us to fly at an altitude of 1,500 feet over our alternate for a minimum of 30 minutes. In this case, this was 1,128 kilos. Jet Airways had then also added 1 hour of APU burn, which is 105 kilos, and in total this led to an absolute minimum fuel, according to Jet Airways, of 15,295 kilos for this flight. Like I mentioned before, the captain then decided to add another 750 kilos of fuel, about 19 minutes extra flight time, and then he rounded the total fuel up to the closest 100, ending up at 16,100 kilos of fuel, which was well above the minimum required for this flight. Once the crew had decided on the fuel they were going to take, they now started looking into all of the other preparation material as well. And the first officer took quite keen interest into the NOTAMs. These are documents that indicate if something is working or not working at the destination and the alternate airports, and also the airports en route. And his attention to detail is going to become important in this story. Once the pilots were happy with their pre-flight preparation, they walked over to their 6 cabin crew members that was going to fly with them on that day, and then they all together walked out to the aircraft and started preparing it for departure. They boarded their 142 passengers that was scheduled for the flights over towards Cochin, and the captain was going to be pilot flying for the flight, and the first officer was going to be pilot monitoring. The aircraft in itself was a 3-year-old 737-800, which was fully serviceable. There was nothing wrong with it. The pilots completed their pre-flight preparation, they received pushback and start clearance, and then started taxiing out for departure. At time 1937 UTC, that's just about 10 minutes past 1 o'clock local time, the aircraft departed from Doha and started flying towards Cochin in India. The climb out and the cruise phase of this flight was completely uneventful, and at time 2300 UTC, that's about 4:30 in the morning in Cochin, the flight crew got into contact with Cochin ATC to get the latest weather. ATC responded and reported that the weather was quite nice in Cochin. It was 3,500 meters in mist, some few clouds at 1,500 feet and light winds. So this was more or less exactly what the pilots had expected. So the captain started setting up for a standard ILS approach in runway 27 in Cochin, and that approach is something we call a full procedure approach. This means that instead of getting radar vectored onto the final approach before landing, the crew would have to fly in over a VOR navigate that was situated close to the airfield, and then they would have to fly out to a specific distance before they could turn in and join the ILS procedurally. About 48 minutes later, at time 23:48, the aircraft arrived above Cochin VOR and started flying outbound for the approach. At this point, they had about 4,844 kilos of fuel available, which was much more than their minimum diversion fuel towards Bangalore. The crew started to slow the aircraft down according to procedure. They started to extend their flaps and completing their landing checklists. The minimum visibility for this approach was 650 meters, and the minimum, the lowest point that they could fly down to before they had to do a missed approach, was 320 feet. And the crew was not expecting any problems with this, given the weather they just received. But as they were descending down the glide slope, it became more and more obvious that the weather was actually much worse than expected. And when the captain reached the minima, 320 feet, he couldn't see anything. So he executed the first go-around. After the go-around, the crew entered a holding pattern over Cochin VOR, and they now started discussing how to proceed. They had 4,699 kilos of fuel on board, and the minimum diversion fuel towards Bangalore was 3,306, so they still had a lot of fuel. They knew that the weather in Bangalore was good and that they had a working ILS approach there, but they now started looking into the other alternates that were a little bit closer to see if they maybe could change their alternate to one of them in order to give them even more fuel margin to do possibly 1 or 2 more approaches into Cochin. The 2 alternates they were now looking into was Coimbatore, which was the closest one, and Trivandrum, which was a little bit further away. But when they were discussing this, the first officer told the captain that actually in Trivandrum we have to be a bit careful, because even though it normally has an ILS approach there, the ILS approaches was down for maintenance for about a week, so they only have non-precision approaches, a VOR approach available in Trivandrum. The captain acknowledged this, and they checked what the weather was like in Trivandrum, and it was given as 3,000 meters, which was well above the minimum requirement for a VOR approach into there, so the captain felt quite confident about it. As they were discussing this and setting up for the second approach into runway 27, two Air India Express Boeing 737s were ahead of them on final. The first one managed to land and reported that he could see the runway at about 1,400 feet, but that there were low clouds moving around the airport. The second Air India Express had to go around. So when Jet Airways flight 555 started their second approach, Cochin ATC came in and told them that the visibility was now 2,500 meters and that there were low clouds at about 600 feet. The second approach proceeded exactly like the first one, with the pilots reaching the minima without having any sign of the runway in front of them. They now executed their second go-around and once again entered holding pattern over Cochin. The fuel was now 3,919 kilos, which was still more than the minimum of 3,306 kilos they needed to divert to Bangalore, but the captain now wanted to redesignate their alternate to Trivandrum instead, because if he did so, that would give him approximately 20 minutes longer, which he could use to do a third approach in towards Cochin. The first officer was not very happy with this. He pointed out to the captain that the weather was actually getting worse, not better, and that the sun was about to rise, and that would make it even harder to see through the haze. The captain countered that argument with the fact that they had Coimbatore as an alternate airport that was even closer than Trivandrum if they would need it, but they never took any weather for Coimbatore. At time 0020 and 6 seconds, the crew of Jet Airways Flight 555 informed air traffic control that they were now redesignating Trivandrum as their primary alternate. And this is where you guys need to pay particular attention at the decision making, because up until this point, the decision making that these two pilots have made is just like any other flight crew. They decided to take some extra fuel because they saw that the weather was a little bit iffy at Cochin. They then flew the flight, they executed a go-around on the first approach attempt, they went into holding, they discussed their fuel state, they did a second approach that also led to a go-around, and now they're in the holding pattern discussing what to do further. And you can see how the captain is reasoning, right? He has listened to air traffic control, they've given him good weather. He has also listened to some pilot reports, both from aircraft that has been on approach but also on the runway, saying that the visibility is generally around 3,000 meters, but there's some few clouds moving around. So it's likely that he thinks that they were just unlucky on their first two attempts, okay? They just managed to hit those few clouds, and on the third attempt, they are going to get this aircraft down on the ground. But while he is thinking like this, he's also painting himself into a corner. He's getting fewer and fewer options available to him, and that is going to lead to some quite crazy things coming up next. So after this short message from my sponsor, I'm going to tell you all about it. Did you know that every time that you access a public Wi-Fi, hackers could potentially access your data and steal your identity? Scary, right? That's why I use NordVPN, today's sponsor, because I want to make sure that whenever I am browsing the web, my personal emails, my bank details and everything else is secure. It takes just one click. You open the map, select which server you want to use, click on it, and you're connected. It's that easy. And now they've done some serious upgrades, including the new threat protection and double VPN, which will give you a much smoother online experience. No more bandwidth throttling or annoying ads. With these new anti-malware features, NordVPN has actually become more than a VPN. It's now a really powerful cybersecurity tool. So if you want to start browsing the internet safely with an exclusive NordVPN deal that will give you an amazing discount, well, then use the link here in the description below, which is nordvpn.com/pilot. And you have nothing to lose because NordVPN offers a full 30-day money-back guarantee. Now back to the video. The crew now started to prepare for their third approach into runway 27, and as they did so, another flight, a Kuwait flight 329, went around ahead of them. That prompted air traffic control to update the weather to a visibility of 2,000 meters and scattered clouds at 400 feet. Air traffic control now asked the Jet Airways crew what their intentions were, and the captain informed them that in case of missed approach, they would request a diversion straight down towards Trivandrum. ATC then told them that the latest weather they had for Trivandrum was a visibility of 3,000 meters and overcast clouds at 1,500 feet. Still perfectly okay for the VOR approach. So the crew initiated their third approach with exactly the same result. They came down to the minima, saw nothing and executed their now third missed approach for the day. When they started flying their missed approach procedure, air traffic control told them to climb straight ahead to 4,000 feet and then turn left to join the Cochin radial 180 and proceed down towards Trivandrum. The crew acknowledged this and started flying according to their cleared route, and at this point they had a fuel of about 2,644 kilos, and the minimum diversion fuel down towards Trivandrum was 2,614 kilos, so they're basically bang on their minimum diversion fuel. They requested to climb to 21,000 feet to flight level 210, and as they were cleared to climb, they received an updated weather report from Trivandrum where the visibility had now started to go down to 2,500 meters. At time 0102 UTC, that's 0630 local time, the Jet Airways crew got into contact with Trivandrum ATC. Trivandrum ATC told them that they could expect runway 14 for the VOR approach and that the visibility has now gone down to 1,500 meters. And that's a problem because the minimum visibility to start the VOR approach for that runway was 2,100 meters. When the captain heard this, he asked if there was high-intensity approach lights and runway lights available to him because he wanted to use something called converted MET visibility in order to start the approach. Now, converted MET visibility is basically a tool that we pilots have when we're flying and we don't have access to proper RVR. We only have reported MET visibility, and that was the case here. Because if you, for example, can see 500 meters normal visibility, but you're looking at a very strong light, it's very likely that you'll be able to see that light at a much further distance. So especially during hours of darkness, we can actually use a table to convert reported visibility into converted MET visibility and thus get a higher visibility number to enable us to start an approach. And that was what the captain was trying to do here. Unfortunately, at this runway, that wasn't available. So our traffic control told him that no, we only have a simple approach light system with high intensity. But anyway, the captain did the conversion anyway, which enabled him to start the approach, and this is where things are starting to get a little bit sketchy. The crew now starts descending down towards Trivandrum, but when they're about 25 miles away from the airport, the captain realizes that he's way too high to start this approach. That might be because he was expecting to do a full procedural arrival and he actually started getting radar vectors in for the approach, but in any case he had to do a 360-degree turn in order to lose a little bit of altitude, which of course used up a little bit of fuel as well. After this, the crew declares minimum fuel to air traffic control. Minimum fuel is the first step in a multi-step process indicating that they have a fuel problem. And minimum fuel is not an emergency call, but it tells air traffic control that this aircraft has reduced its available airport down to 1 and that any change to their current clearance might lead to this aircraft landing with less than final reserve fuel. And anytime that an aircrew sees that they're going to land with less than final reserve, they have to declare an emergency, which is the next step in that process. Air traffic control acknowledged the message and cleared the crew for a VOR approach runway 14, and they also cleared them to land runway 14 with a visibility of 2,000 meters. At time 0119 UTC, Jet Airways flight 555 reaches its minimum descent altitude on the VOR approach without being able to see the runway. This now means that they have to execute their fourth go-around of the day, and when they hit the toga buttons, they're down to a fuel of 1,324 kilos. And remember that the final reserve fuel is only about 1,300 kilo. And that means that 40 seconds after they initiate the go-around, they now call Mayday, 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 fuel. Jet Airways flight 555. Whenever a fuel emergency is announced, this opens up all available runways, airports and approaches for the aircraft that has declared the emergency. This includes military airports as well. So after having declared the emergency, the captain now asks air traffic control if he can do a visual approach in for runway 14 instead. And this is where things are starting to get really, really crazy. Because remember, they've just done a VOR approach down to runway 14. They didn't see enough to land from that approach. So to be able to do a visual approach, as the name suggests, you're doing that visually. You need to see the whole runway and the runway environment clearly in order to safely do a visual approach, which is not backed up by any nav aids. Now, a visual approach is something that we would do in order to do a slightly tighter approach, in order to save some time and fuel, but you have to have really, really good weather in order to do this, and they do not have this weather. Now, I understand that the captain at this point is probably starting to panic a little bit. He doesn't think that he has enough fuel to safely fly a full procedure VOR approach in, and he just wants to get the aircraft down on the ground. But on the other hand, he doesn't see the runway, so it doesn't make any sense. Anyway, he levels off the aircraft at approximately 1,000 feet above ground level, which is lower than we would normally do during a visual approach. He then flies downwind until he is approximately abeam, the threshold for runway 14, and as they pass the abeam point, they call up air traffic control and tell them that they are now turning base for runway 14. Air traffic control tells them that you are just passing the abeam point, confirm that you can see the runway, indicating that air traffic control thinks that they're way too close to make the 90-degree turn to start getting themselves onto final. The crew reads this back, they descend down to 500 feet and then turns towards the airport. But because they cannot see the airport properly, they end up to the right of centerline and way too low. And once they realize this, when they finally see the runway, the captain turns abruptly to the left, causing a bank angle warning. And when he hears the bank angle, he now goes around for the 5th time. They now have only 898 kilos on board, and the captain once again asks if he can do another visual approach for runway 14. Because he's in an emergency, air traffic control approves this. Once again, he levels off at 1,000 feet, and he gets an updated visibility report from the Thiruvananthapuram ATC saying that they now have 2,000 meters visibility, which is way too low for what he is doing. He continues down once again, initiates his base turn way too early, descending to 500 feet on base, and once again ends up in a position where he's not aligned with the runway and he's too high, prompting an incredible 6th go-around for the day. The fuel is now 662 kilos and things are starting to get really, really critical. Unless they can manage to get this aircraft down on the ground within the next 10 to 12 minutes, they will run out of fuel, and the captain is well aware of this. Because of this, he now tells air traffic control and his colleague that he intends to, instead of doing another circuit for runway 14, he wants to do a 180-degree turn to land on the opposite runway, runway 32, which would be slightly quicker. The problem is, of course, that he still is in cloud. He doesn't see anything. So he takes control of the aircraft, turns slightly to the left in order to widen the turn slightly, and then starts turning right to join with the final approach. As he's doing this, the first EGP-WS warning goes on, saying terrain, terrain, followed by a second saying terrain, terrain, pull up. The pilot's responds to both of these warnings with saying out loud that they're visual with the terrain below them, and the first officer reaches over and inhibits the ground proximity warning system. At time 01:38 and 6 seconds, the first officer looks over to the captain and asks, "Do you know where it is?" And the captain just responds, "Just flying blindly." They then continue to descend down towards the runway. The bank angle warning comes on several times. The latest one is at 50 feet above the runway. And at time 01:39, they manage to touch down safely on runway 32. The aircraft is okay, passengers and crew are okay, and they taxi into the airport. The final total fuel recorded on board after the engines were shut down at the gate was 349 kilos. Just to give you some perspective, the aircraft normally burns about 40 to 50 kilos per minute and about twice as much if it's on climb thrusts. Because the pilots had declared an emergency, the cockpit voice recording was preserved and sent into the investigation team, and that, together with the safety report that the crew filed, lay foundation to the incident report that I've just told you about. But after the cockpit voice recorder had been removed and replaced, the crew of this flight simply refueled the aircraft and flew back to Cochin on the very same day. And that's just something that I personally cannot understand, because what they've just been through is basically a near-death experience, right? Their adrenaline levels must have been through the roof, and to think that they would be fit to fly on a second flight on the same day after something like this is just unfathomable. The findings of the investigation showed that the weather was obviously a factor that led the pilots into this situation. But it also showed that there was insufficient guidance from the company, from Jet Airways, on how the pilots should be thinking about doing multiple approaches into an airport where the weather was marginal. And just to give you an example, the airline that I work for myself, we have a rule saying that you can do 2 approaches into the same airport with the same weather. But in order to do a third approach, you need the weather to have doubled. If that's not the case, so if you're hovering around the same kind of marginal weather as you did during the first 2 approaches, well then you have to divert. And obviously you want to divert to an airport where you are reasonably sure that you can get down. Specifically, you want to fly to an airport where you have, if possible, a precision approach to fly to. To go to an alternate airport where the weather is equally marginal as the airport that you just left behind you, but where the approach rates are worse, is setting you up for a potentially very, very bad situation, which this crew definitely experienced. Now, the final report also stated that the pilots broke several rules and regulations during this flight, which ultimately endangered the safety of the crew, the passengers, and the aircraft. But I don't know what happened to them. I don't know if they lost their jobs or if they continue to fly, and I don't really care, because these videos are not about assigning blame. It's about learning something. It's about knowing what has happened and how the industry has learned from it and become safer. That's all I want to do. One thing I can say though is that this final report was very poorly written. It left out a lot of details. I would have loved to know what kind of discussions, communications there was between the flight crew and the cabin crew and also the passengers, because I can't even begin to imagine the amount of discomfort and potentially fear that the passengers would have felt during this flight, having to go through 6 go-arounds on one single flight. And if you were a passenger on this flight out there, feel free to reach out to me with an email. I would love to hear from you about this experience. Now, if you want to see a video that I think that you're really going to enjoy, check this one out, or maybe this one. If you want to support the work that I do here on the channel, then consider becoming part of my lovely Patreon crew and join my next weekly hangout. I'd love to see you there. And you can also buy yourself some merch. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.